He only came to walk my dog. That was all. A simple job, a quick hello, maybe a polite smile at the door before heading out with the leash. But the moment I opened that door, something shifted. His voice carried warmth I didn't expect. His eyes lingered longer than they should have. And before I could even make sense of it, the quiet routine of my life began to unravel, pulling me into something I never thought I'd find again: love, danger, and a desire that refused to stay hidden. The first time he came, it was just another Tuesday morning for me. I had been living alone for a while, my only constant companion being Max, my energetic golden retriever who seemed to have more stamina than I could ever dream of. The truth was, I didn't hire a dog walker because I was lazy, but because life had become heavier than I cared to admit. Mornings were quiet, too quiet sometimes, and the silence pressed against my chest like a weight. Hiring someone to take Max out was supposed to be a small relief, a way to breathe a little easier, maybe even buy myself a few more hours of pretending I was fine. I still remember the knock on the door. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, and for some reason, it made my heart beat faster. I opened it, expecting the usual stranger with a polite smile and a rushed demeanor, but instead, I found him. He stood there with a leash in his hand, casual in jeans and a simple shirt, hair slightly messy as if he hadn't tried too hard but somehow looked perfect because of it. His eyes were calm, but they carried a spark that unsettled me. "You must be Max's dad," he said, and his voice had a lightness that immediately cut through the stiffness I carried in my chest. I laughed awkwardly, nodding as Max bounded forward, tail wagging wildly. Max loved everyone, but the way he leapt toward this man felt different, like he already knew something I didn't. As I watched him kneel to rub Max's ears, something inside me softened. The stranger introduced himself simply, no long explanation, just his name, and then he asked about Max's routine. I tried to keep it professional, answering his questions, but I kept catching myself noticing small details: the way he smiled with just half of his mouth, the way he tilted his head when he listened, how his hand brushed against Max's fur with a gentleness I hadn't seen in people for a long time. I realized I had been staring too long when he glanced up and caught me, and for a moment, I thought he would laugh. Instead, he just held my gaze, not with arrogance but with a quiet steadiness that made my stomach twist. When they finally left for the walk, I stood at the door longer than I should have, listening to Max's happy barks fading down the street. The apartment felt emptier than usual, as if something important had just walked out with them. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being ridiculous. He was just a dog walker. He wasn't here for me. He wasn't going to fix the silence in my life. And yet, when the door opened again an hour later and he returned with Max panting happily at his side, I felt that strange flutter again, the kind I hadn't felt in years. He told me Max behaved well, joked about how Max nearly dragged him across the park chasing a squirrel, and then, before leaving, he gave me a look that lingered just a moment too long. I told myself not to read into it, but the truth is, that look stayed with me long after the door closed. That night, I kept replaying it all in my head, the way his voice sounded, the way Max seemed drawn to him, the way I felt seen in a way I hadn't been for so long. I lay in bed, restless, wondering why a stranger's presence could stir something inside me that I thought was long buried. Maybe it was just loneliness, maybe it was wishful thinking, or maybe it was the start of something I didn't even know I was ready for. All I knew was that I couldn't wait for him to come back tomorrow. The next morning, I found myself preparing for his arrival in ways I didn't want to admit. I had woken up earlier than usual, showered, even made coffee that I didn't really need. It was almost embarrassing how much thought I put into something as simple as being presentable, but it wasn't about vanity, it was about the quiet hope that maybe he would notice. When the knock finally came, it was softer this time, but it still stirred something in me, as if I had been waiting for that exact sound all along. I opened the door, and there he was again, the same easy smile, the same calm energy that seemed to settle the air around him. Max rushed forward like he had been waiting all night too, practically bouncing into his arms. He laughed, a sound that was warm and effortless, and I caught myself smiling wider than I had in weeks. He asked if Max had eaten, and though it was a simple question, the way he asked, like he genuinely cared, made me feel something stir inside. Most people kept their voices light, detached, but his words always seemed to carry weight, as though he meant every single one. I gave him Max's leash and tried to step back like yesterday, but instead, I found myself lingering, asking how his evening had been, what he did after the walk. He answered casually, mentioning he had gone home, watched a show, nothing extraordinary. But it wasn't about the details, it was about the way he looked at me when he spoke, holding my eyes in that steady way again, making me feel like I mattered in that small moment. He left with Max again, and I thought I would be fine, but as soon as the door shut, I found myself pacing. It was ridiculous how restless I felt, how aware I was of the clock. I kept listening for the faint sounds in the hallway, like the world outside my apartment suddenly had meaning only because he was part of it. When he came back, I noticed something new. His hair was damp, like he had showered before coming over, and his shirt carried the faintest scent of cologne. I told myself not to think about it too much, but it was impossible not to. He talked about Max pulling toward the lake, how the dog splashed in the shallow water and nearly ruined his shoes, and as he told me, his hands moved when he spoke, expressive in a way that made me watch them longer than I should have. His laugh, his gestures, the way his lips curved around each word, it was all too much and not enough at the same time. When he handed me the leash, our fingers brushed. It was barely anything, a passing touch, but it felt like a jolt of electricity shot straight through me. He didn't pull away immediately, and for a second, neither did I. Our eyes met, and the air seemed heavier, thicker, as though something unspoken passed between us. Max barked, breaking the moment, and we both laughed nervously, looking away too quickly. He left soon after, and again, I told myself not to read into it. But the truth is, I couldn't stop. That touch lingered on my skin like it had left a mark. I walked around the apartment, distracted, unfocused, unable to shake the memory of how his hand felt against mine. Later that night, as I sat with Max curled at my feet, I thought about how strange it was for a routine, something as ordinary as a dog walker, to become the highlight of my day. I thought about how I had built walls around myself for so long, convincing myself that I didn't need anyone, that solitude was safer. But now, with every knock on the door, those walls were starting to crack. And I didn't know if I was ready for what might come through once they broke completely. The third day arrived with a strange tension I couldn't explain. I had barely slept the night before, my mind restless with replaying every detail of the last two encounters. The way his smile softened when he looked at me, the brush of his fingers, the warmth in his voice, all of it circled endlessly in my head like a song I couldn't turn off. When morning came, I found myself tidying the apartment obsessively, straightening pillows, wiping down counters that were already clean, even spraying air freshener I rarely used. It wasn't for Max. It wasn't even for me. I knew exactly who I was doing it for, though I refused to say it out loud. When the knock came, sharp but familiar, my chest tightened. I opened the door, and he stood there again, same effortless charm, but today there was something different about the way he looked at me. His eyes lingered longer, and his smile seemed a little more hesitant, as if he, too, felt the shift between us. Max bounded out, tail wagging uncontrollably, but my focus was glued to him, not the dog. He asked the usual questions about Max's breakfast, but then, without warning, he glanced past me into the apartment, as though curious about the space I lived in. I don't know why, but my instinct was to invite him in. "Do you want some water before you go?" The word slipped out before I could second-guess myself. He paused, almost surprised, then nodded. "Sure, thanks." He stepped inside, and suddenly, the air in the apartment felt different, heavier somehow. He looked around casually, not judging, just observing, and I found myself seeing my home through his eyes, simple, quiet, maybe a little too empty. I poured him a glass of water, and when I handed it to him, our fingers brushed again, deliberate this time, not accidental. The pause that followed felt like an entire conversation we weren't speaking. He thanked me softly, took a sip, and then smiled as if he could feel my nerves radiating across the room. "You live alone?" he asked gently, and I nodded, suddenly feeling exposed. I wanted to say more, explain why the silence in these walls had become both a comfort and a prison, but my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I only said, "It's just me and Max." He looked down at Max, who was wagging his tail at his feet, then back at me. "Seems like he keeps you from being too lonely." The words cut deeper than I expected, because they were true. Max was my anchor, the reason I got up in the morning, the reason I didn't drown in the stillness of my life. But in that moment, standing in my kitchen with this man who had only just entered my world, I realized Max wasn't the only one pulling me out of the loneliness anymore. He left shortly after, taking Max for his walk, but the silence that returned after the door closed was no longer the same. It wasn't just emptiness, it was anticipation. Every sound in the hallway made me perk up, waiting for the footsteps that would bring him back. When he did return, his cheeks were flushed from the cold air, and Max was soaked from chasing after the fountain in the park. He laughed as he told me the story, his eyes bright, his gestures animated, and I stood there, caught between wanting to listen forever and wanting to lean closer just to feel the warmth radiating from him. Before he left, he hesitated at the door. His hand rested on the frame, and he looked at me for a moment too long. "I'll see you tomorrow?" he asked, as if seeking reassurance. "Yeah," I said quickly, maybe too quickly. He smiled, softer this time, almost like a secret. "Good." When the door shut behind him, I leaned against it, my heart racing. It was no longer just about Max, no longer just about the routine. Something was growing, quietly but undeniably, and I knew I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't ignore. The fourth morning felt different before it even began. I woke up earlier than usual, not because of Max barking or the sunlight streaming through the curtains, but because of a restless excitement that had carried me through the night. My thoughts had been tangled with his smile, his voice, the quiet pauses that stretched between us like invisible threads pulling tighter each time. I stood in front of the mirror longer than necessary, brushing my hair, changing shirts twice, telling myself it didn't matter what I looked like, but still fussing over the details. It wasn't vanity, it was that aching hope that when he looked at me today, he might linger just a little longer. When the knock came, it was softer this time, almost tentative, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I opened the door, and there he was, holding the leash as usual, but his expression wasn't just casual politeness. His eyes seemed to search mine, as though he was waiting for something unspoken. Max jumped around, wagging his tail, but my focus was entirely on him. He greeted me with the same warmth, but I noticed the way his voice dipped lower, almost careful, like he was aware of the closeness that had started to grow between us. Without thinking, I asked him if he wanted coffee before taking Max out. He hesitated, glanced down at Max, then back at me, and smiled. "Sure, I could use one." It was such a simple agreement, yet it made my heart race. He stepped inside, and suddenly, the apartment didn't feel so empty anymore. I brewed the coffee, trying to steady my hands while he leaned against the counter, watching me with that calm, steady gaze that always seemed to unravel me. We talked about nothing and everything, how Max nearly escaped the leash yesterday, how he once had a dog of his own, how the city felt both too big and too small sometimes. His words flowed easily, but underneath them, I felt something heavier, something lingering between the lines. When I handed him his cup, our fingers brushed again, and this time neither of us pulled away. The pause that followed was filled with silence, but it wasn't awkward. It was charged, full, like the air before a storm. He finally looked down, almost shy, and whispered, "Thanks." I wanted to ask him to stay longer, to sit down with me, to stretch this moment until the world outside ceased to exist. But instead, he took Max's leash, and with a smile that didn't quite hide the same tension I was feeling, he stepped out. While they were gone, I couldn't focus on anything else. I paced the apartment, my mind replaying his smile, the way his eyes softened when he spoke about his past dog, the warmth of his hand against mine. It felt absurd how deeply this stranger was starting to matter, how quickly my solitude had been invaded by something I had thought I didn't deserve anymore. When he came back, Max was panting happily, his fur damp from running through wet grass. He laughed as he explained how Max had chased another squirrel, his voice animated, his hands moving in wide gestures. I found myself watching his lips more than his words, caught up in the way his expression lit up when he laughed. As he handed me the leash, his hand lingered again, but this time he didn't let go immediately. His eyes met mine, steady, unwavering, and for a second the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Then Max barked, breaking the spell, and he pulled away with a soft chuckle. "He's got more energy than both of us combined," he said, his voice lighter now, but his eyes still holding that unspoken weight. He turned toward the door, but before leaving, he paused. "Maybe tomorrow, we could take him out together?" The words landed in my chest with a force I wasn't prepared for. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, I'd like that." He smiled, and it was different this time, not polite, not casual, but something deeper, something that promised this was no longer just about Max. When the door closed behind him, I leaned against it again, but instead of emptiness, I felt a pulse of something alive running through me. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, the silence of my life would no longer belong just to me. The next day felt like it had been waiting for me long before the sun even rose. I could barely get through my morning routine, every small task done with a restless energy that left me pacing, checking the clock every few minutes. Today wasn't going to be like the others. Today, for the first time, we would walk Max together, and the thought of it filled me with a nervous anticipation that had my chest tight and my palms sweating. When the knock finally came, it was firm but gentle, almost as if he knew I was already standing on the other side of the door waiting. I opened it, and there he was, with that same easy smile but softer, more deliberate, like he, too, had been thinking about this moment since yesterday. Max leapt toward him excitedly, but I barely noticed. All I could feel was the heat in my chest as his eyes met mine. "Ready?" he asked, holding up the leash, and for a second, I forgot how to answer. I nodded quickly, grabbing my jacket, and together we stepped out into the crisp morning air with Max bounding happily ahead. Walking beside him felt strange at first, like I had to relearn how to move in the world. For so long, my walks had been solitary, my silence uninterrupted, and now here he was, his arm brushing against mine every so often, his voice breaking through the walls I had built around myself. We talked about simple things at first, the park, the weather, Max's boundless energy, but beneath those words was a closeness that grew with every step. His laugh was easy, warm, and I realized I kept trying to make him laugh just to hear it again. At one point, Max tugged hard at the leash, pulling both of us forward at the same time. We stumbled, and instinctively, his hand shot out to steady me. It was just a touch, his palm pressed lightly against my arm, but the warmth of it lingered, spreading through me long after he let go. Our eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between us before we both looked away, pretending to focus on Max. We reached the park, and Max immediately tore off toward the open grass, barking joyfully. We let him run, watching him with shared amusement, but I couldn't help glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. The way the morning light fell across his face, the curve of his smile, the calm steadiness in his posture, it all felt like a photograph I wanted to keep with me forever. He noticed me staring, and instead of looking away, he held my gaze. For a moment, it was as if the world around us disappeared, the noise of the park fading until it was just him and me, standing in the middle of something I didn't yet have the courage to name. He broke the silence first, his voice softer now. You don't come here often, do you? I shook my head, admitting quietly, not really. I don't go out much. He tilted his head, studying me in that way he always did, like he was trying to read the pages I kept closed. Why not? I wanted to give him some easy excuse, but the truth slipped out before I could stop it. It's easier to stay inside. Less chance of feeling alone. The words hung heavy between us, and I immediately regretted them, but instead of pity, his eyes softened with understanding. He didn't try to fill the silence or offer empty reassurances. He just stood there, close enough that I could feel the quiet strength of his presence, and somehow that was enough. We spent the rest of the walk talking about lighter things, but the weight of that moment never left. When we finally returned to my apartment, Max panting happily at our heels, neither of us seemed eager to say goodbye. He lingered at the door, his hand resting on the frame just like before, his eyes holding mine with that same steady intensity. I enjoyed this, he said quietly, almost as if he was afraid of breaking whatever fragile thread had formed between us. Me too, I answered, my voice barely more than a whisper. There was a pause, longer this time, filled with something that made my pulse race. For a fleeting second, I thought he might step closer, that the space between us might finally collapse. But then Max barked, wagging his tail impatiently, and the moment broke. He smiled, a little ruefully, and stepped back. Tomorrow? He asked, and the word carried more than just a question. Tomorrow, I agreed, holding his gaze until the door closed between us. Alone again, I leaned against the door, my heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. Something was happening, something I couldn't ignore anymore. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't want to. The next morning came with a nervous energy I couldn't shake. I moved through my apartment as if every object in it mattered suddenly, straightening cushions, fixing the way a book leaned against another on the shelf, adjusting the curtains so the light fell softer across the room. It was foolish, maybe even childish, but I wanted everything to feel right, as though he would notice those small changes and somehow understand the quiet invitation behind them. When the knock came, my pulse quickened so fast I had to take a breath before opening the door. He stood there again, but today there was a difference in the way he looked at me. It wasn't just a polite smile or casual warmth, it was deeper, heavier, as if the unspoken tension between us had followed him inside the hallway. Max bounded forward like always, but even he seemed to sense the shift, circling between us with an excitement that only made the air tighter. He asked if I was ready for another walk, but his voice was softer than usual, almost hesitant. I nodded, grabbing my jacket, and together we stepped out into the cool morning air. The city felt quieter today, the streets less busy, the world somehow more distant, as if it knew this wasn't just another walk. We fell into step easily, our shoulders brushing more often now, neither of us making an effort to move away. Small talk came, but it was sparse, filled more with pauses than words. And it was in those pauses that I felt the truth of what was building between us. When we reached the park, Max ran ahead, splashing through the damp grass, but instead of following him, we slowed, walking side by side with no real direction. At one point, his hand brushed against mine, not by accident this time but with a quiet intention that made my breath catch. I didn't pull away, and he didn't either. For a few steps, we walked like that, our fingers almost touching, and the silence grew thick with the weight of something that had been waiting too long. Finally, he stopped, his eyes on me in a way that made everything else blur. "I've been meaning to ask," he said, his voice low, "do you ever feel like you've been waiting for something without even realizing it?" The question hit me harder than I expected, because it was the truth I had been circling around without naming. I swallowed, my throat dry, and answered quietly, "Every day." His gaze softened, and he let out a small breath, as though my words had given him permission to release something he'd been holding back. We stood there, caught in the space between fear and desire, until Max barked, jolting us back to the world around us. He laughed, rubbing the back of his neck, but the tension didn't fade, it only deepened. On the way back, He didn't speak much, but his hand found mine again, just briefly, enough to send warmth spreading through me that lasted long after we reached my door. When we stepped inside, Max flopped onto the floor, exhausted, and for the first time, he didn't leave immediately. He lingered, leaning against the counter while I poured water into a bowl for Max. The silence was different now, heavier, yet somehow comforting. I could feel his eyes on me, and when I finally looked up, he didn't look away. There was no humor in his expression, no casual ease, just something raw and unguarded that made my chest ache. "You don't let many people in, do you?" he asked softly. I shook my head, unable to find the words. He nodded, as if he had expected that answer, then stepped closer, just enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. For a moment, it felt like the world was holding its breath again, waiting to see if we would close the distance. But instead, he gave me a small, almost hesitant smile and said, "I'll see you tomorrow." It was such a simple sentence, but it carried a weight that settled deep inside me, a promise and a question all at once. When the door closed behind him, I stood there frozen, my chest tight with a longing I hadn't felt in years. Something was breaking open inside me, something I had locked away for too long. And I knew, without a doubt, that tomorrow would not be the same as today. The following day, I woke with a heaviness in my chest that wasn't sadness but something far more complicated. It was anticipation wrapped in fear, desire tangled with hesitation, a constant push and pull that kept me restless. I moved through the morning like a man half awake, every sound magnified, every tick of the clock pulling me closer to the moment I had been waiting for and dreading at the same time. When the knock came, my breath caught in my throat, and for a second I almost didn't move, as if opening the door would mean surrendering to something I wasn't sure I could handle. But then I did, and there he was, framed by the light in the hallway, his expression softer than I had ever seen it. He didn't smile right away this time. Instead, he looked at me with an intensity that made the space between us feel fragile, like glass ready to shatter. Max bounded forward as always, but neither of us paid him much attention. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, almost careful. "Do you still want to go together?" he asked. I nodded, though the truth was I wanted more than just a walk. We stepped outside, and the air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth from last night's rain. Max trotted ahead, the leash taut in his excitement, but our steps were slower, more deliberate, like we both knew this wasn't about the walk anymore. Words felt unnecessary, and for a while, silence was enough, though my heart beat so hard I could hear it in my ears. When we reached the park, Max ran free across the open grass, and we stood watching him, side by side but closer than before. Our shoulders brushed, then lingered, and I felt the warmth of him seeping into me, grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. He turned to me suddenly, his eyes searching mine. "You seem different," he said softly. "Lighter somehow." I laughed faintly, shaking my head. "That's funny, because I feel heavier. Like I'm carrying something I can't put down." His expression didn't falter. "Maybe you're not supposed to put it down. Maybe you're supposed to share it." The words hit me hard, disarming me completely, and before I could stop myself, I whispered, "I don't even know if I remember how." For a moment, we just stood there, caught in the weight of that admission. Then, without warning, his hand found mine, not by accident, not tentative, but deliberate and steady. I froze, my breath trapped in my chest, and yet I didn't pull away. His fingers intertwined with mine, and the world seemed to fall silent. Max barked in the distance, but it barely reached me. All I could feel was the warmth of his hand, the truth of what had been building between us finally breaking the surface. We walked like that for a while, hand in hand, no longer pretending, no longer hiding behind casual smiles and polite words. And with every step, I felt something inside me unravel, walls crumbling piece by piece. By the time we returned to my apartment, the silence between us was thick with things neither of us had said. Max collapsed onto the rug, exhausted, but we remained standing by the door, still holding hands, neither of us willing to let go. He looked at me, his eyes soft but unwavering, and whispered, "Can I stay a while?" My throat tightened, but I nodded. Of course. We moved into the living room, sitting side by side on the couch, our hands never breaking apart. At first, we talked, small things, stories from his past, fragments of my own, but the words soon gave way to silences that spoke louder. His knee brushed against mine, his shoulder pressed close, and every small touch sent a rush of heat through me. When I finally turned to face him, he was already looking at me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, he leaned closer, his breath warm against my cheek. My heart hammered, my mind screamed with every reason to stop, to pull away, to protect the fragile safety of solitude. But my body betrayed me. I didn't move back. I let the space close. His lips brushed mine, hesitant at first, as if asking for permission. And in that instant, every lonely night, every silent morning, every wall I had built around myself fell away. I kissed him back, fully, desperately, like I had been waiting for this moment my entire life. When we finally pulled apart, breathless, he rested his forehead against mine and whispered, "I've wanted to do that since the first day." My chest ached, but not with loneliness, this time it was something new, something alive. I held him closer, afraid to let go, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone anymore. That night did not end when the sun went down, because neither of us wanted to let go of what had finally broken free between us. After that kiss, the world seemed quieter, softer, as if even the walls of my apartment understood something had changed. We stayed close on the couch, Max curled lazily at our feet, his steady breathing grounding us while we sat in the fragile warmth of something new. He didn't rush to fill the silence, and neither did I. Instead, we let our shoulders touch, our hands remain entwined, both of us afraid that moving too quickly would shatter the moment we had been building toward for days. He eventually leaned back, his head resting against the couch, and turned to me with a look I will never forget, part wonder, part relief, and part fear, as though he, too, had not expected to find this here, in my small apartment, in the quiet routine of walking a dog. "I wasn't planning this," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "But now I can't imagine not being here." The honesty in his words pierced me, because they echoed everything I felt but had been too afraid to say. I wanted to tell him how long I had been living behind walls, how I had convinced myself that solitude was safer, that love wasn't meant for me anymore. Instead, I only said, "Neither can I." And somehow, that was enough. The hours slipped by unnoticed as we talked, not just about small things but about real things, the scars we carried, the disappointments we had learned to hide, the loneliness that had shaped us more than we wanted to admit. With every word, I felt the distance between us collapse until there was nothing left to hide behind. When his hand cupped my cheek and he kissed me again, it was slower this time, deeper, filled with the kind of need that wasn't about lust but about finally being seen. The world outside no longer existed, and for once, I didn't want it to. Later, when Max stirred and the clock ticked past midnight, he shifted as though to leave, but I stopped him without thinking, my hand catching his. "Stay," I whispered, the word trembling with both fear and longing. He studied me for a moment, then nodded, and the relief that washed over me was like air after drowning. We didn't rush anything. We lay side by side in the quiet of my bedroom, the dog curled at the foot of the bed, his presence a gentle reminder that this was real, that this wasn't some fleeting fantasy. He held me like he had always belonged there, his arm draped across my chest, his breath steady against my neck. Sleep came slowly, not because I was restless, but because I didn't want to miss a second of the warmth surrounding me. In the soft hours before dawn, I realized something I had been denying myself for so long. Love had found me when I wasn't looking, and it had come through the simplest doorway, someone knocking to walk my dog. It wasn't dramatic or planned, it wasn't some grand gesture. It was quiet, patient, steady, and yet it had undone me completely. By morning, when sunlight spilled through the curtains, I woke to the feeling of him still beside me, his hand still holding mine even in sleep. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel the heaviness of an empty day ahead. I felt possibility, hope, and the kind of happiness I had forgotten was even possible. Max stretched at the foot of the bed, yawning loudly as if to remind us he had been the reason this all began. I smiled at that, turning to the man beside me, and when he opened his eyes, sleep still clinging to him, he smiled back with a tenderness that melted whatever fragments of loneliness were left inside me. It struck me then that life had shifted forever, that there would be no going back to the silence I once thought was my only safety. Because now, he wasn't just the man who came to walk my dog. He was the man who had walked straight into my life, into my heart, and into a place I never thought I would open again. And as I lay there, my hand in his, Max's tail thumping softly against the sheets, I knew this was only the beginning of something I had been waiting for all along.